I felt their hands on me, one on each side, their breath warm against my skin as they moved with perfect rhythm. The pool lights cast dancing shadows across our bodies, and I was lost between them, caught in a moment I never saw coming. My husband slept peacefully inside while I discovered what it meant to be completely overwhelmed by desire. Before we dive into this, hit that like button and subscribe if you're ready for a story that'll leave you breathless. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The party had been Greg's idea. Just a casual thing with the neighbors, he'd said. Nothing fancy. But as I stood by our kitchen window watching Xavier and Jude set up their elaborate sound system by the pool, I had a feeling this night would be anything but casual. Xavier caught my eye through the glass and waved. Even from a distance, I could see that confident smile that had been making my pulse quicken for months. He was the kind of man who moved through the world with easy assurance, his dark hair always perfectly tousled, his shirts fitting just right across broad shoulders. Jude, standing beside him adjusting speakers, was his perfect complement, quieter, but no less magnetic, with those intense green eyes that seemed to see everything. "You're staring," Greg said, coming up behind me with a beer already open. It was barely 6 o'clock. "Just watching them work," I replied, but my voice sounded breathier than intended. Greg chuckled, already loose from the drinks he'd started an hour ago. "Those guys know how to throw a party. Good thing we only have to walk next door to get home." I watched him take another long drink and felt a familiar knot of frustration in my stomach. Greg had been drinking more lately, using it to unwind from work stress, but it meant our evenings together had become predictable. He'd have a few beers, get sleepy, and be snoring by 10 o'clock. The sun was setting when we made our way to Xavier and Jude's backyard. They'd transformed the space into something magical. String lights reflected off the pool's surface, citronella candles flickered on every table, and the sound system played something smooth and hypnotic that seemed to pulse through the warm air. "Ava!" Xavier appeared at my side almost immediately, his hand finding the small of my back as he guided me toward the pool area. "You look incredible." I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a flowing summer dress that hugged my curves but moved beautifully in the evening breeze. The fabric was thin enough that I could feel the warmth of his palm through it, and when he leaned close to speak over the music, his cologne made my head spin. "Thanks for doing this," I said, gesturing toward the setup. "It's gorgeous." "Anything for our favorite neighbors," Jude said, appearing with a cocktail that was already perfectly mixed. "Whiskey sour, right?" I remembered. The fact that he'd remembered my drink preference from a casual conversation weeks ago sent a small thrill through me. Greg was already deep in conversation with other neighbors, beer in hand, completely oblivious to the attention I was receiving. The night progressed, I found myself gravitating toward Xavier and Jude. They were natural hosts, making sure everyone felt included, but I noticed the way their attention kept returning to me. When Xavier handed me a fresh drink, his fingers lingered against mine. When Jude complimented my dress, his eyes traveled over me with unmistakable appreciation. "Your husband's quite the storyteller," Xavier said during a lull in conversation, nodding toward where Greg was regaling a group with some work anecdote, his words slightly slurred. "He gets passionate about his stories when he's had a few drinks," I said diplomatically. "And you?" Jude asked, moving closer. "What are you passionate about?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with meaning. I took a sip of my drink, buying time, feeling the alcohol warm my blood and loosen my inhibitions. "I'm still figuring that out," I admitted. Xavier laughed, low and knowing. "I think you know more than you're letting on." By 10:30, most of the neighbors had drifted home. Greg was slumped in a lounge chair, his empty beer bottle balanced precariously on his chest, soft snores escaping his lips. I should have woken him, should have suggested we head home, but something kept me rooted in place. "Lightweight," Jude observed, looking at my sleeping husband with amusement rather than judgment. "He's been working a lot of overtime," I said, though the excuse felt hollow even to me. "Poor guy," Xavier said, settling onto the lounge chair beside mine. "But his loss is our gain. We get to spend more time with you." The pool lights had shifted to a deeper blue, casting everything in an otherworldly glow. The music had changed too, becoming something more intimate, more seductive. I was acutely aware of being alone with these two men who had been featuring in my thoughts more often than they should. "Want to cool off?" Jude asked, already pulling his shirt over his head. "The water's perfect." I watched, mesmerized, as he dove cleanly into the pool. His body cut through the water with practiced ease, and when he surfaced, droplets caught the light like tiny stars across his shoulders. "I don't have a swimsuit," I protested weakly. Xavier stood and began unbuttoning his shirt. "Neither do we, technically. Jude's in his boxers, and I'm about to be." The casual way he stripped down to his underwear made my mouth go dry. These weren't shy, fumbling boys. They were confident men who knew exactly what they were doing, and they were inviting me to join them. Come on, Ava, Jude called from the water. The dress will dry. Live a little. I glanced at Greg, still dead to the world, then back at the two men watching me expectantly. The alcohol, the warm night air, the intoxicating sense of freedom, it all combined to push me past my usual boundaries. Turn around, I said, and they both obliged with theatrical chivalry. I slipped out of my dress, leaving me in my matching black underwear. The fabric was lace, more revealing than I'd planned, but the way both men's eyes widened when they turned back made me feel powerful rather than exposed. The water was exactly the right temperature, warm enough to be comfortable but cool enough to make my skin tingle. I waded in slowly, hyper-aware of how the wet fabric clung to my body, of how Xavier and Jude were watching my every movement. Better? Xavier asked as I settled into the water. Much, I breathed, letting myself float backward, staring up at the stars. They moved closer, flanking me on either side. I could feel the water displacement from their movements, could sense their presence even with my eyes closed. When Xavier's fingers brushed against my arm, I didn't pull away. You're tense, he observed, his touch becoming more deliberate. Stressed. Everyone's stressed, I replied, but my voice caught as Jude's hand found my other arm. Not everyone. Has to be, Jude said softly. Sometimes you just need to let go. Their hands were gentle but sure, massaging the tension from my shoulders as I floated between them. The boundaries I'd maintained for months began to dissolve under their touch and the weight of the warm water. This is... I started, then trailed off, unsure how to finish. Nice, Xavier suggested, his hand moving to the small of my back. Dangerous, I whispered. The best things usually are, Jude murmured, and I felt his lips brush against my shoulder. I should have protested, should have remembered my sleeping husband 20 feet away, but rational thought was becoming impossible. Their touch was awakening something in me that had been dormant for too long, a hunger I'd forgotten I possessed. When Xavier's mouth found my neck, I let out a small sound that was half protest, half surrender. His lips were warm and sure, tracing patterns that made my pulse race. Jude's hands had found my waist, steadying me as the sensations threatened to overwhelm my balance. Tell us to stop, Xavier breathed against my ear. And we will. But I couldn't form the words. Instead, I found myself turning toward him, my lips seeking his in the dim light. The kiss was electric, months of suppressed attraction igniting in an instant. His mouth was warm and confident, his tongue teasing mine in ways that made my entire body respond. I felt Jude behind me, his chest pressed against my back, his hands exploring the curves of my waist. When he began placing soft kisses along my spine, I arched against him involuntarily. You're incredible, he whispered, his voice rough with desire. They moved with perfect coordination, as if they'd done this before, reading each other's cues, seamlessly. Xavier's hands traced the edge of my damp fabric, while Jude's found the sensitive spot where my neck met my shoulder. I was caught between them, overwhelmed by sensation, my usual control slipping away with each touch. The water made everything feel dreamlike, weightless. When Xavier lifted me slightly, I wrapped my legs around his waist instinctively. The intimacy of the position sent shockwaves through me, especially when I felt Jude press closer behind me. Ava, Xavier said my name like a prayer, his eyes searching mine for permission. I answered by pulling him closer, claiming his mouth with a desperation that surprised us both. This was madness, I knew, but it was the most alive I'd felt in months. Their hands were everywhere, tracing my silhouette, exploring the contours of my body through the thin, wet fabric. Every touch sent ripples of heat through me, building, something that felt both urgent and inevitable. When Xavier's fingers found the sensitive spot beneath my ear, I gasped, my head falling back against Jude's shoulder. They were learning my responses, cataloging what made me shiver, what made me sigh. We should move this inside, Jude suggested, his voice strained with control. I glanced toward Greg, still unconscious in his chair, then back at these two men who were offering me something I'd been craving without even realizing it. Your room? I whispered, the words feeling foreign and thrilling on my tongue. They didn't need to be asked twice. Xavier lifted me from the water as if I weighed nothing, my legs still wrapped around him. Jude grabbed towels, wrapping one around my shoulders as we made our way silently toward their house. The guest room was dimly lit, furnished simply but elegantly. Xavier set me down gently, his hands never leaving my body, while Jude closed the door behind us with a soft click. Are you sure? Xavier asked, studying my face in the low light. Instead of answering with words, I reached for him, pulling him down for another kiss. This time there was no hesitation, no holding back. The kiss deepened, became something desperate and consuming. Felt Jude behind me again, his fingers working at the clasp of my damp garment. When it fell away, his sharp intake of breath made me feel beautiful, desired in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. Perfect, he breathed, his hands skimming over newly exposed skin. Xavier's mouth left mine to trail lower, following paths that made me arch and gasp. His technique was different from what I was used to, more attentive, more focused on my pleasure than his own urgency. They worked together seamlessly, one supporting me while the other explored, switching roles without awkwardness. When Xavier's mouth found my most sensitive places, I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out. Jude's hands, tangled in my hair, tilting my head back so he could claim my mouth while Xavier continued his careful attention below. The dual sensations were overwhelming. I felt caught in a storm of feeling that was building toward something incredible. "Let go," Jude whispered against my lips. "Let us take care of you." And I did. I surrendered completely to their touch, to the way they seemed to know exactly what I needed. When the first wave of release crashed over me, my knees buckled, but they were there to catch me, to hold me steady as pleasure rolled through me in endless waves. "Beautiful," Xavier murmured, pressing soft kisses to my trembling thighs, but they weren't done with me. As I caught my breath, they began again, their touches more confident now, more demanding. Xavier rose to claim my mouth while Jude's hands continued the careful exploration that had left me breathless. "Your turn," I managed to say, reaching for Xavier with shaking hands. What followed was unlike anything I'd experienced. They guided me, showed me what they wanted, but always with gentle instruction rather than demand. When I took Xavier into my mouth, Jude's hands continued their careful attention, ensuring I remained lost in sensation even as I focused on giving pleasure. The taste of Xavier, the feeling of Jude's sure touch, it was sensory overload that left me dizzy with desire. When Xavier's breathing became ragged, when his hands tightened in my hair, I felt a surge of power that was intoxicating. "Switch," Jude said roughly, and they changed positions with fluid grace. Taking Jude was different. He was slightly larger, his responses more vocal. Xavier moved behind me, his hands exploring curves and valleys with increasing boldness. When his fingers found places that made me gasp around Jude, the vibrations made him groan my name. I started, but couldn't finish the thought. "We know," Xavier said, understanding immediately. They moved me to the bed, arranging me, with gentle hands and soft commands. When Xavier positioned himself above me, his eyes searched mine one final time. "Yes," I whispered before he could ask. The feeling of him entering me was exquisite. He moved slowly, allowing me to adjust, to savor every inch. When he was fully seated, we both stilled, overwhelmed by the perfection of the connection. Jude positioned himself beside us, his hands roaming over my body as Xavier began to move. The rhythm they established was hypnotic, slow and deep, building pressure with each careful thrust. When Jude's mouth found my breast, his tongue circling sensitive peaks, I arched beneath them both. The dual attention was almost too much to bear, pleasure building in layers that threatened to consume me entirely. "More," I gasped, and they responded immediately. Xavier's pace increased, his movements becoming more urgent. Jude's mouth moved lower, adding his attention to places that made me cry out. The sensations layered and compounded until I was trembling on the edge of something massive. "Together," Xavier breathed, and somehow I understood. When my release finally came, it was with an intensity that left me seeing stars. I felt Xavier follow me over the edge, his body tensing as he found his own completion. Jude's careful attention prolonged everything, drawing out waves of pleasure until I was completely spent. We collapsed together in a tangle of limbs, all three of us breathing hard. Xavier's arm was around my waist, Jude's hand resting on my hip. For long moments, no one spoke. I began, then laughed softly. "I don't have words." "Perfect," Jude supplied, pressing a gentle kiss to my shoulder. "Incredible," Xavier agreed, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. But as the euphoria faded, reality began to creep back in. Greg was still passed out by the pool. I was naked in bed with my neighbors. The magnitude of what I'd done started to sink in. I started to sit up, but Xavier's arm tightened around me. "Stay a little longer," he said softly. "Just a few more minutes." I allowed myself to be pulled back down, to enjoy the afterglow a little longer. Their touch was gentle now, soothing rather than arousing. It felt safe, cherished. Emotions I hadn't associated with physical intimacy in longer than I cared to. Admit eventually, though, I couldn't ignore reality any longer. I slipped from between them, gathering my still damp clothes. They watched me dress with expressions that held promise rather than regret. "This doesn't have to be complicated," Jude said as I reached for the door. "Doesn't it?" I asked, pausing with my hand on the handle. "Only if we let it be," Xavier replied. "We're neighbors, we're friends. Sometimes friends take care of each other." Their casual attitude should have bothered me, but instead it felt like permission to have enjoyed what happened, without drowning in guilt. I slipped back outside to find Greg exactly where I'd left him, snoring peacefully. I managed to wake him enough to get him home and into bed, where he collapsed immediately, none the wiser about how I'd spent the last hour. Standing in our bathroom, staring at my reflection, I could see the change in myself. My hair was mussed, my lips slightly swollen, my skin flushed with satisfaction. I looked like a woman who had been thoroughly loved. The next morning, Greg woke with a hangover and no memory of the end of the party. "Did I embarrass myself?" he asked over coffee. "You just fell asleep," I said truthfully. "Xavier and Jude said goodnight for you." He laughed ruefully. "Good neighbors. I'll have to thank them." Later that day, I saw Xavier in his yard. He caught my eye and smiled, not smug or knowing, just warm and friendly. When Jude appeared beside him and waved, I felt that familiar flutter in my stomach. That evening, as Greg settled in with his beer and the evening news, I found myself staring out the kitchen window again. This time, when Xavier appeared in his yard and gestured toward the pool, I didn't look away. I glanced at Greg, already getting drowsy on the couch, then back at Xavier. Jude had joined him, and both men were looking at me with expectant expressions. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I thought about how alive I'd felt the night before, how completely I'd surrendered to pleasure, how natural it had seemed to be with them both. I mouthed 15 minutes through the glass, and Xavier's smile was brilliant. Some lines once crossed, change you forever. Was I wrong to want that feeling again, or was I just finally brave enough to take what I needed? I'm curious what you think. Would you have gone back for more, or walked away? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more stories that push every boundary. Thanks for being here with me.